Welcome back, friends. We have been building the pixel art program. Previously, we have built a function that allows us to draw one square anywhere in the XY grid. We have seen also that to create a row of squares is best for us to use a loop, which looks like a repeat loop in Scratch. We are going to use a for loop for this purpose. And we have also seen the range function. Now, we are going to put all this together. In this video, we are going to create a for loop, which helps us to create a row of squares. Now, for loop really is more than the repeat in Scratch. We are going to see not only the anatomy of the for loop, the mistakes we might make and what we have to be careful about. We'll also do a comparison against the repeat loop. How is it that I'm saying for is actually more than repeat? So let's get started. Remember, previously we had been doing this program. We were trying to draw this row of squares. We had drawn 4 squares, but then we realized that this is turning out to be very cumbersome, very laborious process. We will be better served by using a loop here, some kind of a repeat loop here. And I mentioned that the way we do it in Python is using a for loop. Now, one thing to realize immediately is that if I want, for example, 20 squares on my row, then I'll have to repeat this statement 20 times. If I want, for instance, 10 squares in this row, I'll have to repeat this 10 times and so on and so forth, right? So for that purpose, I can create myself a variable, let's say call it ncalls, and that means the number of columns, and say I define it to 20. Now, if I want 20 squares, like I said, I'm going to have to repeat 20 times. So we will do it using a for loop. Let me first put this for loop in place and then we can discuss its anatomy. So I'm going to say for jj in range, say n calls. I'm going to put a colon here and I'm just going to use just this portion that I'll be repeating again and again, right? So I'll say control X here and control V, but I want it to be part of the for loop. So I will do an indentation at this point, right? I'm going to remove this. Uh, Now let's just kind of see this working first and then try to understand why exactly things are working the way they are working. So if I do this much, I get indeed a row created with 20 elements. You can convince yourself there are 20 elements in this. You can count and see for yourself. But why must this work? What exactly is going on? For a start, let's just look at the way this loop is written, right? So we have basically written for a for jj, which is a variable, but we have not initialized it anywhere. So I've just used a new variable here for jj in range n calls. Now remember, the range function gives us a sequence of numbers. So when we are saying range n calls is 20, which means that this sequence here is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 until 19. Now, what that means is that there are 20 elements in that sequence, and JJ is taking those values, right? So we can kind of intuitively feel that this code is going to make whatever is in here repeat 20 times because this sequence has got 20 values, right? So that's what really is going on. This code is making this loop is repeating this code exactly 20 times, and that's why you are getting these 20 squares, right? Now briefly about the syntax. So it's always for some variable name in some sequence. Now this sequence, in this case we are using a range function. We can also use a list, and then whatever is to be repeated has to be put after a colon, just like in if else block or in the def block. In the function definition, we have to have that colon, and we must indent this portion. And remember, just like in the if else, this loop will get over the moment indentation gets over, right? So basically indentation is what is again demarcating a logical sequence of code. Let's say by mistake I did not indent this line, right? So now what's going to happen is that my loop has only become for jj in range n calls, draw rectangle, xval yval 2020. So which means that I'm not incrementing xval as part of the loop. And in fact, if I did this, you will notice what I'll see is that I'll end up with 20 squares being drawn on top of each other because my xval no longer is part of the loop, right? So just to make sure that it's part of the repeated loop, I must also indent xval, right? If I do this, it's all going to work correctly, right? I mean, like it was previously doing. So now this particular for loop, the way we have set up, is really like a repeat loop. I just want to go back to Scratch a little bit to do a little bit of compare and contrast so that things become a little bit more clearer for everybody, right? Say previously we had in the Brick Breaker game, for example, we had put one row of sprites, we have made clones of it, but you see the similarity between this code that we have written now to what we had done earlier, right? So if we have set n calls to 20, we have set x and y initial values, likewise to minus 200 and 200. And then we had a repeat loop, repeat column times. Here we are saying for JJ in range n calls. Remember, n calls is also meant to be like a column. So this code really, what's happening is that this particular portion is being repeated 20 times. And likewise, this particular portion is being repeated 20 times. So the way we have used the for loop so far is in fact exactly equivalent to what happens in the Scratch repeat loop. But as I've been mentioning again and again, for loop is in fact more than just a repeat. So why is it, I mean, in what way is it more? And what can we do with it if it's more, right? Let's see this as we go forward. In fact, for loop can be understood as a repeat loop with a variable, right? So it's a repeat loop, all right, but in addition there is a variable. In this case our variable is JJ. Remember, our syntax is for JJ in range and calls, draw rectangle and x12 plus 20. So without us doing anything, without we having to write any extra statement, what is going on really is that the value of JJ is being changed in this loop. In fact, JJ is taking on the values that are the values that are this sequence range and calls. Remember, this sequence was going from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 until 20. So what's going to happen is that in repetition 1, JJ will be 0 because JJ is in this range, so this sequence. Repetition 2, JJ will be 1, repetition 3, JJ will be 2, because remember this sequence exactly is what range and calls had given us, right? So basically, JJ is taking every value from that sequence as the loop is proceeding. Now to convince ourselves of this, let's say we go back here and I just put, let's say for example here, print JJ and end equals to say a space. Now I do this because I want this all to appear in one row. Otherwise, remember, if I don't give any end, it's going to create a new line for me. So just to make it more concise, I write like this. It will draw the squares. Let it draw all the squares. On the console, it's going to write for me the values of JJ every loop. Notice it did 0 until 19. And this should really not surprise us because we have previously seen the range function. It gives us a sequence from 0 to 19 in this case. And we are really telling JJ taking values in this range. So what's really going on here? So let's just go back again to Scratch and see how we would implement something like this in Scratch, right? And this is quite insightful, I think. In Python we have just said for JJ in range and calls and done everything. If we had to do the same exact thing in Scratch, we have a repeat loop, but we will have to additionally put a variable. So we'll put a variable here, set JJ to say 0, and in this case we are going to have to change JJ by 1 because my range and calls is changing by 1. If I was using a different range, then I have to change a JJ by some other number. But the magical part or the beautiful part here is that in Python, when we are writing this for loop, there is no need to set the initial value of JJ and also no need to change its value every repetition. It all happens by itself. And that is why the Python for loop is in fact bigger than the Scratch repeat loop, because along with the repetition, it comes with this variable which we can use in our code, as we'll see later on. So this variable is getting incremented, or it's taking on new values every time the loop is traversed, and that becomes extremely powerful. We will see its uses as we go along. The value of, the fact that this JJ is changing every increment, we will in fact make use of this in the next video to give a different color for every square that we put inside that row. And you will see the value of this for loop coming through at that point of time. Take care. Thank you so much. Bye bye.